Good morning. Thank you for that prayer, Bob. It's always wonderful to hear you pray because he uses a lot of scripture in his prayer, which is a great thing to do. Well, we are in the chapter 9 of Hebrews today. I'm moving slower than I had outlined originally, but that's okay. I started out trying to cover verses 1 through 14 of chapter 9, and I got to verse 10, and I realized I didn't have any more time left, so I stopped right there. But anyway, we're in this book of Hebrews, which is a wonderful book, and these Hebrew Christians, they were called at that time Messianic Christians, were balking at the new covenant because they were being persecuted for believing in Jesus, and they were wanting to go back to their old ways. Sometimes we're more comfortable in the old ways, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. But before I get into this quickly, there are questions that people come up and ask me afterwards, and sometimes in between, and I sometimes even get them by email or whatever. And I thought I'd share a couple with you because if certain people have questions, they may be questions that other people have. So just a couple of them to start this morning. I won't tell you who this one's from, Jack. But after last week, and I was talking about all of the how hard the job was as priest and how many animals they had to kill and all this kind of stuff, he asked the question afterwards, how many priests were there? Well, I took a wild guess because I hadn't really looked it up individually. They're all listed in the Bible, by the way, if you want to read through that. But usually when you get to that list, you kind of skip through because these are names that you don't know anything about. But anyway, I guessed there were 50 to 100,000. And that was just a wild guess. But there was a different time periods. If you looked at the time of Moses, there were going to be fewer than at the peak at the time of David. So I looked it up. At the time of Moses, when he led the children out of Egypt, the total population that he led out, according to the Bible anyway, was 600,000 fighting men. But if you include a mother, a wife, and 2.5 children, how do you get to 2.5? It's just an average. That's what we used to have in the U.S. We're less than that now. You're going to come up with 2 million people. So that's how many he let out. Now, it lists then there were 22,000 Levites. Now, all Levites were not priests, but all priests were Levites. But there are 22,000, and all served in the temple. And the priests all served in the temple, and they rotated because it was a hard job. In fact, they cast lots as to whose turn would come up next. I'll get to that a little bit later. But in the time of David, if you want to look up the names, 1 Chronicles 24, they're all listed. The estimated population at that time of Israelites was 5 million people. You know, they haven't grown a whole lot because there's only 7.5 million in Israel today. Isn't that interesting? There were 24 priestly divisions. One division was 24,000, 1 Chronicles 27:2. There were 576,000 serving Levites, but the Levites were also judges and officials. There were 38,000 that were 30 years or older that could serve as priests. So now we're getting down to the number of 38,000. Now, my guess was high as far as Moses, but it was a little low if you look at the time of David. The bottom line of this was there were a lot of priests because it was a hard job and they had to rotate in and out and they needed a lot. Question number 2, I talked about the millions of animals that were sacrificed, and another question was, what happened to these animals? Did they get eaten? Some of you know the answer to that, and they were eaten by whom? The priest. They got the best of meats because these animals were without blemish. So the priest ate the best of the choice steaks of all of those. Now, let me get back to chapter 9 of Hebrews. These Hebrew Christians didn't want to change. They kind of liked where they were before. They were more comfortable with that. But here's a quote from William S. Burroughs. It says, when you stop growing, you start dying. And we know that to be true. You stop growing, you start dying. And there is a peak in our lives when we start down the other side. I won't mention what that is, but Psalms 90:10, and you're familiar with this, says, we are destined to live 70 years, or if by strength, 80 years. Or if you're Bob Vander Zag, or if you're Harry, or if you're a lot of other people, you got super strength and you go all the way to 100. Plus. Albert Einstein said something else. Unless we change our thinking, we cannot change. Think about that. If you don't change your thinking, you can't change. I can tell you that most people I talk to that don't know the Lord, the biggest reason they give me to reject, I like my life the way it is. I don't want to change. I like the things I do. And I tell them, even if it comes to a terrible end, and they still don't want to change because they like the way they have it. By the way, I tell them also, what your want to is now, if you become a Christian, God will change your want to, and you will like your new life better. That was the problem of the Messianic Hebrews who accepted Christ as Savior but were more comfortable with the Old Covenant than the New Covenant. Now, one of the things I've realized going through this, people are more comfortable with the physical than the spiritual. This is where we live day to day. And the spiritual is kind of gets into this mystic thing, and there's bad spirits out there, and of course we have good spirits out there, but it's a little bit mystic to us. So we're a little more comfortable with the physical than the spiritual. And this was first foretold by Moses back in Deuteronomy 18:15, and it was also amplified by Peter in Acts 3:22. He says that a prophet, a man, would be raised up from among you that would reshape all things. In other words, you're going to see a physical God here with you sometime in the future. And Hebrews chapter 9, in the first few verses, is about the earthly tabernacle in which all things in it pointed to this prophet who was Jesus the Messiah, who came to bring us this new and better covenant. Now, speaking for myself, I kind of like the new covenant. How would you like to be back in those bloody days, bringing those animals and having them killed and seeing all that? I don't like blood. I kind of like the new covenant. I don't know what their problem was. I do know what their problem was, but anyway, I like it this way we have it. In this section, the comparisons are going to continue between the Old Covenant and New Covenant. And he compares the tabernacle and temple with the heavenly sanctuary which Christ has entered as our high priest. Christ never became our high priest until he went back to heaven. And he entered the tabernacle, applied his blood. That's when he became our high priest. Now, as we get into this, we're going to be on holy ground. Now, the choir sings, we are on holy ground. I love that song. Sometimes the congregation does too. It's a wonderful song, but we're a little bit on holy ground. The early earthly tabernacle in verses 1 through 10, I won't read that now, I'll get to them individually. Since we tend to do less reading in the book of Leviticus than other books, most Christians are unfamiliar with the details of the Old Testament tabernacle, although you Bible readers and experts in this room, I'm sure, go through all that. But if you remember in Capistrano, when we were down there for a while, we still had our Sunday school, we went through the book of Leviticus. Anybody remember that? And when I told Ron what we were going to do, he said, well, you're going to lose half your class. And I said, we'll see. But we didn't. And Gilbert helped us to make it fun. We had the cartoons, we had all these different things that kind of made it a little less, whatever. But we learned a lot from that. But to understand what Christ has instituted, we must know what he replaced. So we start off here and look at the strategic floor plan that God gave for the tabernacle and later on in the temple. Chapter 9, verse 1 through part of verse 2. Then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part. I'm going to stop right there. Now, for those who don't think the tabernacle was important, God used 3 chapters of the Bible to describe the creation of the world. You know how many chapters he used to describe the tabernacle? 50. You don't think it was important? I think it's pretty important. And so much detail was involved in its design and construction for one key reason. The Old Testament tabernacle was a picture of Jesus Christ. And they were describing him in detail through the tabernacle. It was a traveling worship center for the newly formed nation of Israel. Now, we have private worship, but corporate worship is important. That's why we go and worship together corporately, because we stimulate each other. And private corporate, we're kind of by ourselves. In fact, during COVID, that was a problem with the churches that were not open because there was no corporate worship. You don't get the same thing from the TV. You're by yourself or with your family. The tabernacle was 150 feet long and 75 feet wide, surrounded by a fence. You say, why did they have a fence? Well, there are people that would come in there and get to the wrong place, and what happened? They would die. They enter a place that they shouldn't be. There was one gate 50 feet wide. Now, it's a pretty wide gate. And no one could enter a tabernacle court except through one gate. Now, this is the perfect picture of Jesus Christ, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Now, a lot of people object to there being only one way. In fact, what Frank Sinatra sang, I did it my way. You don't do it very well if you do it your way. The Buddhists say, come one, come all. There are many ways to God. And by the way, they accept all religions, because theirs is not a religion, it's a discipline. Come one, come all. The Hindus say there are many gods and many ways, and the average Joe says that is just too narrow. Just too narrow. It can't be just one way. It's one of the devil's greatest tools that he used. Think about this. God ordained one way to enter physical life, one way to enter the earthly tabernacle, and one way to enter the eternal tabernacle. You know why? He kept it simple, so no one could say, I couldn't find my way. Let's look at its sacred furnishings. I'm not going to read this part here, I'll get to it later. But I want to talk a little bit about the sanctuary. That's what this was called. It was called a sanctuary. Now, a sanctuary is a refuge, is a place. In fact, many places in the Bible, people went to the temple as a refuge. And we have such a thing today called sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. I see some of you shaking your head, but let me tell you, it would be a good thing if they followed the rules of the Bible. In other words, they had to screen every person that came into one of those cities of refuge, because they could only go there to escape someone that was trying to kill them for an accidental murder or an accidental thing that happened. And now, if we did that, it would be fine, but guess what? It's kind of come on, come on. We can divide the furnishings of the tabernacle into three categories: the furnishings of the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. So let's look at the furnishings of the outer court. There were two primary pieces of furniture in the outer court, the altar and the laver. The altar of burnt offerings was first. After entering the gate, the Israelite bringing their animal sacrifice would encounter a large altar where the animal sacrifices were burned. This was just outside of the curtain. They would give their sacrifice to the priest, who would place it on the fire. The individual Israelite could advance no further than the altar in the outer court. Now let's look at the laver. Just beyond the altar was the bronze laver filled with water, which the priests used to cleanse themselves. The penalty for not cleansing was death, of course. Exodus 30:30. Now let's look at the furnishings of the holy place. This will be starting in the last part of verse 2. It says, "In which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary," which we've talked about. Three items in the holy place. There was a lamp, a table with bread, and an incense altar representing light, life, and love in our relationship with God. Here's a great psalm, Psalms 141:2. It says, "Let my prayer be set before you as incense, the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." Might be a good verse to start your prayer with, or even maybe in the prayer circle. It's a wonderful verse. Our sacrifice today is spiritual. It's not physical. We don't bring physical sacrifices. In fact, Romans 12:1 says, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, to present your bodies a living sacrifice unto God, which is your reasonable service." When I was young, I never thought that was very reasonable, but as I grow older, I think that is very reasonable. It's a spiritual sacrifice you're offering to God. The furnishings of light. Next, entering the holy place, to the left stood what we know as the Jewish menorah. The 7-branch candelabra. The 7 flames were fueled by olive oil and provided light inside the holy place. For us, they remind us that Jesus Christ is the light of the world, which he said several times in the book of John. In fact, it was one of the 7 I ams in the book of John, which outlines the book. I am the light of the world. The furnishings of life, the table and the showbread, second I am, so I am the bread of life, was opposite the candelabra stood a small table called the table of showbread, Exodus 35:30. And on the table were 2 stacks of bread, 6 loaves on each stack. And the 12 loaves represented God's sustaining of his covenant people and were replaced every Sabbath with fresh loaves. Now, who ate the bread? Again, the priest. Only the priest could eat that bread. I don't know how I have this in my notes, but if you remember David and his army as they were running from King Saul, And they knew there was bread inside that tabernacle, and they went in and asked the priests for bread. I think the priests were reluctant to give them, but he and his army ate those 12 loaves of bread. And Jesus used that as an example in the New Testament when the Pharisees were challenging him. And he said that the Sabbath and the bread were made for man, not the other way around. So in other words, it was okay because they were hungry. Now Christ, who declared himself as the bread of life, John 6:35 and several other places. Number 3 were the furnishings of love, and that was the altar of incense. This altar stood in the middle of the holy place, just in front of the curtain, separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Hot coals placed on the altar of incense produced a pleasing aroma to the Lord. This is a picture of the prayers of the saints to a God who loves and wants to have fellowship with us. Think about that just a minute. Every time you send your prayers up to God, it's sincerely, it's a pleasing aroma to him, and he loves that. He loves to have fellowship with you through prayer. You learn about him reading the Bible, but you have fellowship with him through prayer. Kind of a funny instance, when Tony and I were in Jerusalem, we went into the Church of the Sepulchre, and there are crowds wandering around here, but there's one hall, big place that was empty. We didn't quite know why it was empty, but we thought that would be a good place to escape to. Well, there were these priests that were dressed in white down at the other end by this big incinerator, it looked like. And I don't know, every 10 minutes or so, they would fill these coals and incense, and they would start running down through the hall. And it would take your breath away, and the odor was not pleasant. So we learned, don't go into that hall at all. What they were trying to replicate, it didn't work for us. I don't think it worked for you either. The furnishings of the Holy of Holies, verses 3 through 5. And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded in the tablets of the covenant. And above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. He's just saying it would take too much space at this particular time to talk about it. Here we find 4 more distinct furnishings, the main one being the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark symbolized the presence of God. When the people marched from place to place, the Ark was carried in the midst or in the middle of the tribes to symbolize the centrality of the presence of God in the midst of Israel. Now I want you to note something here. The ark was always in the midst of the people. God was God's presence. God desires to dwell in the midst of the people. But guess what happened when they were going to war, or they're going into danger? Where did the ark go? It went to the front of the line. God was leading them when they were in danger, and whenever they needed him to lead them, he went to the front of the line. But all the rest of the time, he dwelt in the midst of the people. Of course, you're familiar with the Ark of the Covenant, Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of the best-selling movies of all time, by Indiana Jones. It was one of my favorites at one time. Maybe still be. I haven't looked at it lately. But the ark was an oblong box with a removable lid, and then inside the ark were 3 items. Now, I told you what they are, but I'm going to test your memory. What were they? What was it? 10 Commandments. Aaron's rod. And what was it? Oh, the manna. Right. You passed the test. And what did manna mean? Who?
Food.
What do it mean? In Hebrew.
Oh, what is it?
What is it? You know, God has a sense of humor. He knew when he put that out there, they were going to say, what is this? So he just named it in Hebrew. What is it? It was a miracle food that sustained the Israelites in their wanderings all through the wilderness. Now, Aaron's rod was kept there as a symbol of spiritual authority and care. When Aaron was appointed high priest by Moses, some questioned the appointment. Why him? God caused Aaron's rod to bud with flowers to authenticate God's choice. Now, as I was pondering this and meditating on it, I thought about Romans 13:1, which it says that there is no authority, no president, no dictator on this earth that wasn't appointed by God. And I said, what does this mean? And I thought to this, in a democratic country, we get what we deserve because the majority of the people elect that person. So we have to live with that. You remember when Jonah was in the boat and all those other people were in the boat with him? They didn't do anything wrong. It was Jonah God was after, but if they went down, God got Jonah. He was going to get them all. We happened to be in the boat. I won't say with who, but whatever. Number 4, the item in the second table of stone containing the law. The first was a table of stone. Anyway, all of you know that they built a golden calf while he was up on the 40 days and 40 nights up on the mountain, and God said, you better get back down there because there's stuff going on that you won't like. And he went down the mountain and threw the tables of stone and broke them, so he had to go back up the mountain and get them all over again. The tablet was kept as a reminder of the covenant Israel had entered into with God. Now let's look at the furnishings of prayer, the golden censer. A golden censer was used by the high priest on the Day of Atonement to take hot coals into the Holy of Holies to burn incense and create a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Now let's look at this next section. Is called a spiritual figure in verses 6 through 10. I won't read that yet. The Old Testament saints could not possibly know God as well as we're able to know him through Christ, of course. They worshiped at a distance, where we are invited to enter boldly into his presence. We saw that back in chapter 4, verse 16. There was a limited atonement under the Mosaic system. In other words, it was just a covering atonement until Jesus came and took away all sins. Remember Bette Midler sang the song, God Watches at a Distance? I used to take offense with that song because I thought, no, he's up close and personal. He doesn't watch at a distance. But I discovered this after doing a little research. She was a Jew, an unconverted Jew. So, in a sense, she was under the old covenant and God was at a distance from her. She sang the song from her heart as a Jew. I thought, well, I guess I don't have a problem with the song. But the old saying, if you feel far from God, guess who moved? He's up close and personal. The limited access to the tabernacle is verse 6 through 8. I won't read that yet. Everyone, people, priest, and high priest had limited access to God. The limited access to the people, let's look at in verse 6. Now, when these things had been thus prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle performing the service. The people, the worshipers, could only go as far as the brazen altar inside the outer court of the tabernacle. Both the holy place and the Holy of Holies were off limits. Such a limitation would seem frustrating. Now, I want you to imagine this now. I'm going to bring it up to today. Supposing that we could only come to the outside of the church and look through the stained glass and see the pastors and the deacons worshiping inside, but we couldn't go inside. That's just kind of a picture of what this was at that time. Now, again, the limited access also to the priest in verse 6, same verse. There were many priests, as we saw in the opening, so lots were drawn to see who would serve and when. And when they did get to serve, they were limited to the holy place. They couldn't go any further. If they ventured into the Holy of Holies, against the sentence was death. By the way, why has this sentence of death come so often? God was teaching us over and over, sin equals death. Sin equals death. If you're sin, you're going to die unless there's an atonement for your sin. So there was an element of fear as well. Remember Simeon? He was told, prayed, he would not die until he saw the anointed, until he saw the Messiah. And by the way, he had to be selected to be at that time by lot. So as per chance, he was selected by the lot. God said, put that lot so that Simeon is part of that lot. So he received and held the Christ, one of the first ones, when he was only 9 days old. The limited access of the high priest, and let's look at this in verses 7 and 8. But into the second part the high priest went along once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit indicates this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. Even the high priest was limited in his access to God. He could only enter the Holy of Holies once a year during the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. This all reminds us that access to the presence of God is no trivial thing, even for us. We would be totally cut off from God without Christ as our high priest. Now let's look, as we finish up here, on the limited atonement of the tabernacle in verses 9 and 10. It was symbolic for the present time, in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to conscience, concerning only foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. What is Reformation? The time of Reformation is when it changed to the New Covenant. The Old Testament sacrifice and forgiveness applied only to sins of ignorance. Think about that. There was no sacrifice if you committed a sin willingly, knowingly. No sacrifice. Not willful, premeditated sin. That's why David prayed that God would forgive him of presumptuous sins. What he did, he knew exactly what he was doing. When he murdered... You're right. Exactly. And when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. So in Psalms 10, 12, 13, he knew that there was no sacrifice for that. But eventually David received assurance that his soul would be delivered from the lowest hell. Because that's where you went. If you didn't forgive, you see forgiveness. Psalms 86, 12, and 13. But here is the penalty. This is important. But he would not restore the blessings he had lost. They were gone forever. Think about that. A person that willfully sins, by the way, this is Old Testament. In the New Testament, all sins are forgiven. But there's even a penalty there, but I think we're going to wait till next week to get into that because that'll take a little while. In other words, they're forgiven, but there's still a penalty, even then. In fact, in the very next chapter that we're going to come to, there's a verse that spells that out. And you know, some people say, are there worse sins and there lesser sins, or greater sins or lesser sins? The answer is yes. Even Jesus himself said there were. He said, he that committed the greater sins are the ones that brought me to you, even more than you, because they knew better. So I got to save that till next week, otherwise I'd run way over and you wouldn't be happy with me. Okay, we're going to sing our closing song, and everybody knows this song. We used to sing. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, early in the morning our song shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. God bless you all. Thank you for being here.